Welcome to the Urban Planning Museum of Greater Bridgeport, an online urban planning museum about Greater Bridgeport. For your convenience, whether you're on our website or on YouTube, we have placed timestamps below to each of the different 4 segments of this video. This series goes over the history, zoning, transit, and demographic of each Greater Bridgeport neighborhood, i.e. Bridgeport and its neighboring municipalities, such as Fairfield, Easton, Trumbull, Stratford, Monroe, Shelton, and Milford, to better understand how the places we live are built and managed, and how they impact our daily lives. Each neighborhood has a video dedicated to it, and this serves as the prelude before you enter the neighborhood exhibit. The neighborhood we will cover right now is the east side of Bridgeport, Connecticut is a neighborhood in the eastern portion of Bridgeport, Connecticut. It is bordered by North Bridgeport to the north. The east side of Bridgeport, Connecticut, taking up the whole peninsula, is bordered by the Pequannock River to the east, Mill Creek to the west, Long Island Sound to the south, which is connected to the Atlantic Ocean, and the east side has an estimated population of 14,421 people in 2020. That is, if our friends at the census counted everyone and correctly and not more than, like 10 times, living in 5,515 housing units as of 2006. I tell you the 2021s, but I couldn't find it. Its population density, or number of people per square mile or kilometer who live in the area, is 13,600 square miles for the neighborhood overall, although the number for each individual block varies drastically, with blocks ranging from 5,000 people per square mile to 64,000 people per square mile in this neighborhood. Why that is, we'll look into it shortly. In total, the neighborhood is... I couldn't find data for this. Shame on me. You can forget about it. I'm just kidding. According to the City of Bridgeport's website, 68% of the housing is renter-occupied, and 94% of the housing was built before 1970. This neighborhood in 2023 is zoned like this. Well, basically, the city decides where you can build certain types of buildings, like residential, commercial, industrial, or any combination of those, which is mixed use. An example of mixed-use zoning would be an apartment building with stores below and residences on top. Of course, this is what's allowed to be built here as of 2022. But what the land is actually used for, what's actually built there in 2006, looks like this. We'll get into more of zoning, where people work, where people come from, how much money people have, how much do they make, and where, according to data, people are more likely to get assaulted. But first, let's go over why the east side even exists. In order to understand the history of the east side of Bridgeport, we're first going to go over the history of the city as a whole. Okay, so Pilgrims come in Mayflower, accidentally land in Massachusetts, make it in Plymouth, then they make Boston. Then they decide that Massachusetts Bay is getting too crowded, and so a group of guys go down to Hartford and start Connecticut. Bridgeport, at the mouth of the Pequannock River, with its strategic port, was for centuries the home of the Pequannock Indian tribe, which the British and later the Americans had left alone. Originally, Connecticut colony back in the 1630s had sent Roger Ludlow to set up 2 new settlements along Long Island Sound, one at the mouth of the Housatonic River, which is today's Stratford, and one at the mouth of the Pequannock River, today's downtown Bridgeport, at the mouth of the strategic. Although we can't know for certain, Roger Ludlow most likely was scared of the 500 to 600 or so Native Americans that lived at the mouth of Bridgeport, and instead ended up founding the settlement only in Stratford and then moving to nearby Fairfield, thus creating those 2 settlements. It is believed by 1790, about 15 years after the start of the Revolution, that Bridgeport's population was only about 110 people. At the time, the territory was actually part of the neighboring township of Stratford. That would soon change on the 23rd of December, 1835, when a public meeting was held in Kent, Connecticut, all the way up in rural Litchfield County, Connecticut, with representatives from towns near Danbury, all the way up to Stockbridge, Massachusetts. The purpose was to build a railroad. Railroads, a British invention, had only come to America 7 years earlier when the first railroad was imported. The first railroad in New England had only been built last year, connecting Albany to Boston, Massachusetts. The terminus of this railroad, Bridgeport, where the products could then be shipped along the East Coast, the Atlantic, and the West Indies. As under Connecticut law, only cities could raise shares to fund a new railroad. In 1836, that same year, the city of Bridgeport was born. Bridgeport had been named after a drawbridge on the Pequannock River. The fact that it was a port made sense, and that's why they named it Bridgeport. That bridge, connecting west of the river to east of the river, would soon be followed by another railroad to pass the city. This time in 1848, guys from New York and New Haven made a plan to connect the 2 cities, passing through the Connecticut coast, thus passing through Bridgeport as well, and making Bridgeport a railroad junction, passing through the east side as well, which at the time, the eastern peninsula known as Pembroke, was mostly farmland. Oh yeah, some dude named P.T. Barnum got accidentally stranded in town one snowy night, became super famous, and apparently liked the town so much he decided to move in. I killed 6 whales. So that's what Wolverine does when he's not in the X-Men. Either way, Barnum and his bro William Noble bought land on the other side of the Pequannock River and began a new project, a new town named East Bridgeport. Oh, weird. There's another more obscure movie about P.T. Barnum.
Now be associated with Mr. William Noble, a leading gentleman of Connecticut. We have acquired 224 acres across the Raritan River from Bridgeport. And here, we will build East Bridgeport. It is the city of the future, gentlemen. A home for everyone and everyone in a home.
But where will your people work?
I am confident that it will attract industrial interest. I've invested everything in this.
Lol, that's where it went bad for him. The factory he tried to get there went broke. It was a clock factory. What do you mean there's another TV-only obscure movie about P.T. Barnum?
He's the hero at Tippecanoe.
East Bridgeport, with its relatively flat terrain, was well suited for agriculture. It was sparsely populated farmland, as Black Rock Harbor was where most of the population was centered around. But over time, the mouth of the Pequannock River became the main harbor in the area due to its deeper harbor, allowing it to handle large steamships. By 1836, a guy named Reverend Birdsley G. Noble had bought about 50 acres for development between what is now Pulaski Street and East Main Street and Barnum Avenue. He then petitioned the state legislature for permission to build the bridge, what is today the East Washington Bridge, from his property on the east side to the main part of Bridgeport town across the Pequannock River. The charter was denied, but later Birdsley Noble died and his young son William Noble was able to secure permission for the new bridge, built alongside the aforementioned New York and New Haven rail line. The bridge was built in 1850, with his property split up into house lots and streets. Noble then entered into a partnership with their good friend P.T. Barnum. P.T. Barnum envisioned a whole new community on the other side of the Pequannock River. He worked to encourage manufacturing companies to relocate to East Bridgeport, thus growing the population, raising demand for housing, as well as making money from the whole endeavor. Barnum and Noble planned their new community of East Bridgeport out on a grid pattern, with trees lining up the streets, and at the center of the grid, Washington Park, a 6 to 8 acre square park taking up a block in the center of town. Surrounding it, the land was reserved for the mansions or villas of future factory owners, and further out on these grid streets, the working class. And they set conditions on the distance of the home from the street. In the words of P.T. Barnum in his autobiography, in 1851, I purchased from William H. Noble of Bridgeport the undivided half of his late father's homestead, occupying of 50 acres, lying on the east side of the river, opposite the city of Bridgeport. We intended this as the nucleus of a new city, which we concluded we will soon build up in consequence of the natural advantages it possesses. Before giving publicly to our plans, however, we purchased 174 acres contiguous to which we already owned and laid out the entire property in regular streets, reserving a beautiful grove of 6 or 8 acres which we enclosed and converted to a public park. We then commenced selling alternate lots at the same price which the lots cost us by the acre. Our sales are always made on the condition that a suitable dwelling, house, store, or manufactory should be erected on the land within 1 year of the date of purchase, that every building should be placed at a certain distance from the street in a style of architecture approved by us, that the ground should be enclosed with acceptable fences and be kept clean and neat, with other conditions which we would render the locality a desirable one for respectable residents and appropriate for the mutual benefit of all persons who should become settlers of the new city. The entire property consists of a beautiful plateau of ground lying within less than a half a mile of the center of Bridgeport City. Considering the superiority of the situation, it is a wonder that the city of Bridgeport was not originally founded on that side of the river.
I'd like to address the world through the medium of the latest wonderful invention, Edison's phonograph. So that my voice, like my great show, will reach future generations and be heard centuries after I have joined the great and, as I believe, happy majority.
His first order of business was to build a factory for tenants to use, which was finished in 1852 on William Street and leased to a carriage company. Afterwards, he financed manufacturing companies to relocate to East Bridgeport. After a series of failures, and declaring bankruptcy after the Jerome Clock Company of New Haven failed, one particular machine would change East Bridgeport Since Thomas Saint in 1790, different inventors across Europe have put together various different machines for sewing. The first man to put all these ideas together was Englishman John Fisher in 1841, just before Elias Howe from Massachusetts did in 1844. Howe's machine was similar to Fisher's, only that the fabric was held vertically and that the needle turned away from the point starting at the eye. Due to Fisher's botched patent filing, men like Isaac Merritt Singer had started manufacturing similar machines, but Elias Howe eventually secured the patent to his sewing machine. After touring America, Allen B. Wilson made his own sewing machine until realizing it had already been invented. He teamed up with Nathaniel Wheeler and in Watertown, Connecticut began making sewing machines with a rotating hook. In 1856, the Wheeler and Wilson Sewing Machine Company relocated to East Bridgeport, taking up the space of the failed Jerome Clock Factory. By 1859, Wheeler and Wilson had the most sales of any sewing machine company in the United States, and even had a showroom and offices in London. 9 years later, in 1865, Elias Howe bought land from P.T. Barnum to start his own Howe Sewing Machine Company between what is today Howe and Borough Street, thus starting the concentration of sewing machine companies in East Bridgeport. Soon, more factories on both sides of the river, but especially on the East Bridgeport side of the city, plopped up, concentrated along the rail line. Different corporate clusters of industry soon began to pop up in the new community too, including, but not limited to, the firearms industry. The Union Metallic Cartridge Company was founded in 1865, and the New Haven Arms Company, renamed the Winchester Repeating Arms Company in 1866, after being successfully lured there by Barnum, until they returned to New Haven 5 years later. Opposite of the railroad, the Bridgeport Brass Company would produce the wire connecting the first ever long-distance telephone line between New York and Boston for Bell's AT&T Company, the part of the east side that Barnum and Noble developed. Bounded by the river, East Main Street, Arctic Street, and the railroad tracks has buildings that can be classified into 4 categories. First, the homes of the factory owners, or industrialists, which surround Washington Park, built between the 1860s to 1880s in the Queen Anne or Italian villa style, which was then popular. 4 large churches also surround this park. Then, homes of artisans, factory supervisors, and other middle-class people were built in the blocks alongside, more spread out from the park. These homes were essentially smaller versions of the mansions, but were often built in both single and double house styles. The homes for the working class, the factory workers themselves, could be found all over the community, but primarily surrounding William Street, with row homes, 4-story tenements, and small duplexes. East Main Street would grow to be the commercial spine of the new community, a secondary business section along the peninsula. East Main Street didn't compete with downtown, but rather provided everything people needed without having to inconveniently cross the river every time to head to downtown Bridgeport. Instead of offices, the upper floors would be occupied by residences, with stores below, and immigrants crowded into the upper floors of these tenements.
We sail at the break of day, o'er the raging foam for the sea, ga home on the shores of a merry Cay.